Hello, my name is Matt Bowker and I manage Rhodes Scholars virtual lecture series. And it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you will be hearing from author Christen Girard. Christen is the steward of the Murie Legacy at their historical ranch in Grand Teton National Park, where she also lives. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies from Lewis and Clark College and a Master's in Education in Environmental Education from Western Washington University. And she's the author of a short biography on Margaret and Olaus Murie, published in 2019. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Christen.
Well, thank you, Matt, and hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christen Girard, and I work for the Teton Science Schools. And as Matt said, I am speaking with you today from the historic Murie Ranch, conservation's home. So as some of you may know, the Murie Ranch is a National Historic Landmark District. It's located in the heart of Grand Teton National Park in northwestern Wyoming. And it was home to some rather remarkable people, Marty and Olaus Murie and their families, for the whole latter part of the 20th century. And it was in this place that a lot of our nation's early ideas about wilderness, about wildness, and about what it means to protect wild places in the United States were first shaped and formulated. So today I'm going to share some stories about this couple, their love for each other, their love for nature, and talk a little bit about what it was that made them so effective as advocates for wild places and as voices for conservation. And as I begin, I want to start with one acknowledgement. I'm speaking today from the Murie Ranch, and this ranch is part of the ancestral homelands of the Eastern Shoshone, Bannock, Blackfeet, Crow, and Northern Arapaho tribes. And it is because of generations of Indigenous stewardship here and elsewhere that we are able to tell these stories today and that we are able to build off of this conservation legacy. So with that, let's dive in and head back to the 1920s to Frontier, Alaska, to 1921, the year that Olaus and Marty first meet each other. Now, Olaus is, at this time, a field biologist working for the U.S. Biological Survey, now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he is in Alaska, up in the Arctic, studying caribou herds by dog sled. And he finds himself in Fairbanks, Alaska on one of his resupply trips. And it's there at a friend's dinner party that he meets a young woman named Margaret Thomas, or Marty, and the two strike up a unique friendship. So let's characterize these two individuals briefly. Olaus is about 30 years old at this time. As I said, he's a field biologist. He's also an expert woodsman, an expert naturalist, and really a true adventurer. He was born in 1889 in Moorhead, Minnesota, to Norwegian immigrant parents. And he spent his childhood exploring the Red River that ran through town. His parents were very poor, and his mother believed that education was the route out of poverty. So she always encouraged her sons to pursue their studies. And Olaus, loving wildlife, loving nature as he did, he got a zoology degree. And after graduation, he landed a job studying wildlife in their habitats, which was like a dream come true for him. So this is what eventually takes him up into the Northern Territories, into the Yukon, into Canada, and eventually up into the Arctic. Now, Marty is about a decade younger than Olaus. She's about 20 when they meet. And she also is a true adventurer in her own right. She actually grew up in Fairbanks. So the wild frontier was really part of her childhood. She spent her summers at her father's fish cannery in Prince of Wales Sound, exploring the coastal inlets. And she was a member of the very last horse-drawn sleigh to cross the Valdez Trail before a railroad was built into town that really opened up frontier Alaska to development. So needless to say, a lot of sparks fly between these two, and the pair agree to stay in touch when Olaus returns to his field research in the Arctic. And so they begin writing letters to each other. And this is really how they fall in love. And by 1923, the pair are certain they're going to be married. But first, Marty wants to finish her undergraduate degree. So she enrolls at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And in 1924, she becomes the first female to graduate from that institution and the only senior to graduate that year. Now at this point, she has not heard from Olaus, her beloved, in about 5 months. But in his last letter, he had asked her to meet him on the banks of the Yukon River, where the pair will be married. So Marty assembles a small wedding party, and they travel 800 miles by boat and steamer. And sure enough, Olaus is there just as he said he would be. And the pair get married at some ridiculous time in the morning, about 3 a.m. And then they head off on their honeymoon adventure. So this is 1924. Here the Muries are dressed in their honeymoon attire, and they head off on a 3-month, 550-mile journey by dog sled back up into the Arctic. Now, this is really not your typical honeymoon in terms of length, or I dare say locomotion, but it is also atypical because Olaus is continuing his caribou research at this time. And it's on this journey together that he's teaching Marty everything he knows about nature and about science. And so she's learning so much from him. And the pair together are strengthening their shared love for Alaska, which becomes really important to their story and their work later on. So about a year after the couple return from their honeymoon, Marty gives birth to their first son, Martin, and Olaus is assigned a research trip back up into Alaska along the Old Crow River to study waterfowl. And Marty, she simply refuses to be one of those wives who stays behind while her husband is off having all these great adventures. So she packs her bags and goes along with him. And of course, they bring their little son, Martin, too. So this really becomes the way that the Muries raise their family together. The work is always at the center, and the family life folds itself around it. So whenever Olaus is out on a biological study, the family comes along too. They're tending camp, they're exploring, they're really assisting Olaus with his data collection. Marty was actually one of Olaus's best field technicians. She was always by his side, and she also worked as his secretary during all of his career. So in 1927, Olaus is asked to move his young family to the Jackson Hole Valley in the northwestern corner of Wyoming. And he is asked to study the Jackson Elk Herd, which at the time is the largest elk herd in North America. And they are experiencing, the elk, some pretty high winter mortality rates. And people are starting to be worried. And they want Olaus to make some recommendations for their recovery and their management. Now, at this time, there was a small piece of land that had been set aside as winter habitat for the elk. It was called the National Elk Refuge. And it was about 2,400 acres located just north of the town of Jackson Hole. And so you can see on this map here in the lower left corner, the National Elk Refuge, kind of in light yellow there. These red lines are arrows representing the fall migration routes of the elk herd from their summer habitats down into the elk refuge where they overwinter. So why is Olaus the right man for the job? Well, he is incredibly observant and intuitive in his work. His work is scientifically rigorous. And by this time in his career, he's really established himself as the foremost expert in ungulate ecology in the United States, if not the world. So he does something else that's unique for scientists of his time. And that is that he takes detailed sketches and drawings of not only the wildlife that he's studying, but all of the habitats and ecology and species in those regions that he's studying in. So this really sets him apart. So Olaus studies the elk for the better part of a decade. At this time, the Muries, have added 2 more children to their family, a daughter, Joanne, and another son, Donald. And Olaus finds 3 primary things through his work. The first is that the migration patterns of these elk are being disrupted because of those iconic buck rail fences that are that we often associate with Western ranches, that are actually cutting off elk from that image, those summer habitats, to their winter feeding ground in the southern end of the Jackson Hole Valley. They simply can't get across the fences. The second is that there had been a feeding program established on the refuge a few years before, and it included a non-native grass called foxtail. When the elk ingested this, it was tearing up their intestinal walls. And the third and important thing that Olaus finds is that the size of the refuge at 2,400 acres is simply too small to support the carrying capacity of a herd of this size, and he knows it needs to be expanded. So Olaus does something interesting. He starts petitioning a visionary and entrepreneur in the area by the name of J.D. Rockefeller for some help. Now, Rockefeller had been introduced to the Tetons by a good friend of his, Horace Albright, who was the first superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. And immediately Rockefeller fell in love with this region, but he also noticed and was struck by the high rate, the fast rate of development of the area. And he, like Olaus, recognized that if something wasn't done soon to protect the remaining natural beauty of this area, that there wouldn't be anything left for future generations. So Rockefeller starts what I would call a covert land purchasing company called the Snake River Land Company, and they start purchasing up ranches in the valley. And by the mid-1930s, of the nearly 400 ranches in this area, they successfully buy back about 320 of these. And Rockefeller gives that land over to the federal government for inclusion in an expanded boundary of Grand Teton National Park. This is pretty incredible. And while all this is happening, Olaus is continuing to prod Rockefeller to set some land aside for the elk. And in 1935, that original refuge of 2,400 acres is expanded to about 10 times the size, to about 24,000 acres. So elk begin to thrive. They're on their way back to a healthy population. Now, Olaus has noticed something about himself in all of this work protecting land in the Jackson Hole region, which is that he's equally interested in studying the landscape and the habitats of the wildlife that he's studying as he is in the wildlife itself. So this prompts him to get involved as a founding member of the Wilderness Society in 1935. And by 1945, he officially retires from his career as a field biologist so that he can devote more of his time to this lands preservation work. And by 1945, the Muries are also ready to retire from their home in town to a quieter life. So they purchased this ranch here, the STS Dude Ranch, from their friends, the Estises. And along with their half-brother and half-sister, Ade and Wheezy Murie, the families move out here later that year, 1945. Now, shortly after they moved to the ranch, Olaus gets a call from the Wilderness Society asking him to become the president of the organization. And Olaus initially declines this request because he's just retired to this beautiful ranch in the heart of Grand Teton National Park, and he doesn't want to move his family to Washington, D.C. But a few months later, the organization calls him again, and they share that they've decided to move the headquarters of the Wilderness Society to a little town called Moose, Wyoming. And you can just imagine Olaus thinking, well, that's interesting because that's where I live. And sure enough, the Western headquarters for the Wilderness Society are set up in the Murie's home. And for the next part of the 20th century, their house, their front porch becomes the convening place where all of the deep policy conversations and kind of formative ideas about wilderness and wildness and lands preservation really take shape. So in 1956, the Muries are asked to head a scientific expedition up to Alaska, back into the Arctic along the Shinjek River, to really draw attention to this pristine and untouched wilderness area. And they assemble a small scientific team. They spend the summer up in Alaska documenting all of their findings, and they compile a comprehensive report that they share with folks in Washington, along with many speeches and even an old movie reel about the area. And eventually, all of these efforts lead to the establishment of the first boundary of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the protection of about 8 million acres of wilderness land. This is the largest tract of federally protected wilderness in the United States, and the Muries are overjoyed. This land that they love so much finally has some kind of protection. And they always considered this to be one of the happiest moments in their career. Now, the thing I want to underscore here is that the Muries were first and foremost fierce wilderness advocates. And at the time that they were doing all this work up in Alaska and fighting on its behalf, there was no comprehensive plan for wilderness protection in the United States. There was no definition of wilderness or wildness and no federal protection. So while they're up in Alaska, they ask their good friend and fellow society member, Howard Zonheiser, to caretake their ranch home for the summer. And it's while he's there in Grand Teton National Park that he writes the framework for the Wilderness Act. And it actually takes him 8 years and 66 drafts to pass that piece of legislation through Congress. But he and Olaf and Marty and others persevere. So more on that in a minute. When the Muries return from their Shinjek expedition, they continue fighting relentlessly on behalf of wilderness. By this time, they're touring the country, giving speeches, writing letters, lobbying Congress, and just generally educating the public about the need for wild places. And while they're doing all this conservation work, Olaus is busy fighting his own personal battle as well. And sadly, in October of 1963, at the age of 74, Olaus passes away from cancer. And still, the fight for wilderness continues. And finally, in September of 1964, the Wilderness Act is signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And Marty and actually Howard's wife, Alice Zannheiser, both of whom are pictured here in this image, are invited to attend the signing of this legislation. So here these two women are receiving the presidential pens that signed this law into act. And of course, neither Olaus nor Howard actually are alive to see their dream come true, but it was their efforts that really lay the groundwork for the Wilderness Act and for all of the wilderness conservation that comes after. So it's really after Olaus's death that Marty comes into her own as a conservationist. While Olaus was alive, she really, in some ways, was in the shadows. She was his companion. She was always by his side, deeply involved in the work, but she was never in the spotlight. So after Olaus passed away, these, of course, are really tough years for her initially. She's just lost the love of her life, her companion in all things, after 39 years of marriage. But when her heart has had a little time to heal, she realizes that the way that she can keep his spirit alive and her love for him alive is to commit herself to carrying on his conservation legacy and carrying on the work. So this is what she does. She starts her own letter writing campaign. She continues lobbying Congress, writing speeches, traveling around the country, and being a voice for conservation. She also hosts a lot of conservation leaders at the ranch. And she does this, she fights for wilderness for another 40 years and really becomes the grandmother of the conservation movement. She was an incredibly eloquent speaker and a writer, and she'd been to all of these places that she was fighting to protect. She really spoke from her heart, and people, a lot of politicians, listened to what she had to say. So throughout the 70s and 80s, she really was focusing her efforts up in Alaska, trying to protect more Alaskan wilderness lands. And in 1980, her efforts, along with the efforts of many others, lead to the passage of a big piece of legislation called ANILCA, the Alaska Native Interests Lands Conservation Act. So this is 1980, and it sets aside another 56 million acres of protected land in the Alaska Arctic. So John Denver was a good friend of Marty's and a fellow wilderness lover, and he once said of Marty that she is responsible for saving more land in Alaska than any other human being on the planet. So it was after these achievements in Alaska that people really started to come and visit Marty on the ranch, just to meet with her and to ask her advice on this or that related to the conservation movement. And Marty just loved this. She loved people. She loved hosting people at the ranch and listening to their stories, hearing what it was that inspired them in their lives. She was always ready with tea and cookies. And you better watch out, because if you didn't have dinner plans, suddenly you found yourself at the Murie's family dinner table. And if you didn't have a place to stay lined up, you found yourself in one of the Dude Ranch guest cabins, maybe for a night, maybe for two, maybe for a week. So this is just how the Muries were. As I said, they really loved people. And Marty in particular loved young people. She really recognized in them that they are the future stewards of the earth. And so she was a big champion for youth education. And in fact, in 1967, Marty was a founding board member of the Teton Science Schools, the organization that I work for today. So for all the rest of her life, young people from Teton Science Schools and from other schools throughout the valley would come to visit her every year at her ranch home. And ultimately, Marty passed away in 2003 at the age of 101, almost 40 years to the day that Olaf passed away. And people were visiting her every year until her death. So, like Olaf before her, Marty received nearly every major conservation award. She received 3 honorary doctorates for her lifetime commitment to the movement. And in 1998, she was actually awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is our nation's highest civilian honor, for her conservation efforts. So the Muries really lived in a way that their work and their life blended together. All of nature was important to them. It wasn't just huge tracts of protected wilderness. It was the everyday nature, the backyard nature at their home in Moose, as well as elsewhere, that really gave meaning to their lives and to their interactions with others. And this, I think, is one of the powers of their legacy, this recognition that nature is within you, it's around you all the time, if you care to pay attention. And I would say this too, that the Murie's impact on the conservation movement demonstrates that one person absolutely can make a difference in this world if they put their minds to it. And what the Muries accomplished didn't just materialize, right? It was the years of dedicated effort. And what really set them apart was that they believed in people. They believed that they could convince people to get on board with this whole conservation thing, this wilderness protection. And so they worked tirelessly to do that. And look at what they achieved. The Wilderness Act today protects over 110 million acres of land across the United States, which is an area of land like larger than the size of California. So I will leave you with this, that one of our hopes at the science schools when we share these stories of the Muries is that they inspire you in some way to do something with your life that is personally meaningful to you and that brings you joy. And I think if Marty were on this virtual platform with us today, she would say to each of us that we all have agency over our lives, and that it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter what you are wanting to do. If you do it with a little enthusiasm, if you do it with a little curiosity, you will be effective at whatever it is that you set your mind to. Marty's stepfather always used to say to her, curiosity, that divine thing, curiosity, it will carry you on when all else fails. Thank you.
Thanks, Christen. So as expected, we have lots of questions for you. Our first question, which is, we have several questions asking about the legacy of their children. Did the Murie's children continue their conservation efforts?
Yeah. So the Muries, as I mentioned in the story, had 3 children, Martin, Joanne, and Donald. And kind of true to the Murie's spirit of wanting people to follow their own, authentic interests, the Muries always encourage their children to follow their own passions. And so while nature, I think, was always close to each of the children's hearts, they all expressed that in different ways. So Martin went on to be actually kind of like his father. He was he studied biology, and he was a biology professor, a college biology professor. Joanne was primarily a mother to some wonderful children. And Donald was a filmmaker and a photographer. And later, today, he's still alive. He's the only one of the 3 children that's still alive. And he today is also doing a lot of writing.
Thank you. And just a reminder for everyone out there, you can submit a question using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so the next question. We have a few people asking about what the ranch is like right now. So Christen, you are at the ranch, right?
I am.
So could you give us an update on, are there volunteers living in the ranch today? And what's it like right now with the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, the ranch right now in this area, generally, it's just greening up, it's springing up. The Grand Teton National Park up until Monday had been closed really since COVID began. And just on Monday, Grand Teton, along with Yellowstone, have started some phased reopenings. So people are starting to return to hike on trails and drive some of the roads to view wildlife. That includes the Murie Ranch, which is part of Grand Teton National Park and is public land. At the moment, we have no programs or interpretation, kind of tours of the ranch happening this summer, but the ranch is still open for people to explore on their own.
Great. So we have a question from Allison. Allison asks, how did the Muries work with local people who worked on the land, who had radically different views about land use and conservation?
Yeah, it's a great question. No doubt when the Muries were involved in this work, especially in the early days in Wyoming, lands preservation was a pretty controversial idea. And so they worked quietly, they worked humbly, and they worked really thoughtfully. I mentioned that the Snake River Land Company that Rockefeller established was a covert land company, in the sense that he didn't attach his name to it. He knew that the idea was going to be really unpopular, but it was a set of circumstances like the stock market crash, the Great Depression, that led people to be more eager to sell their properties for a profit. So yes, there was a kind of ethos of wanting to keep private lands private and keep freedoms free. But there were enough people that recognized that there was something special going on here, and that it was a special place worthy of a little bit of protection. And ultimately, more and more people did start to get on board. But I would say the Murie's approach, because they were so humble, because they were so authentic, they were able to have real conversations with people and exchange ideas in a thoughtful way.
Thank you. We have a question from Emily. Emily writes, she's read several biographies about Rachel Carson, and I was wondering, do you think Marty had similar struggles with being a woman in the field, or do you think she was viewed differently by others because she was a mother and a wife, as compared to an expert in the field?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Marty really was a product of her era. As I mentioned, she always was very deeply involved in the work, but it was always Olaf that was in the forefront, and kind of credited with all of the efforts. And when Olaf passed away, Marty was really initially very petrified to step into the spotlight. And she did so in the only authentic way that she knew how, which was to speak from her heart. And she became the perfect voice for conservation, probably credited a lot by her lifelong companionship with Olaf. And they always kind of came together, they worked together. She was a prominent member of the Wilderness Society by the time Olaf passed away. So she'd had this kind of growing background that had been evolving quietly while Olaf was still alive. And I think it's part of what enabled her to step into that spotlight so well. She was already very well respected. She didn't really have to fight her way to the top like other women of the era.
Thank you. So we have a few questions about the elk herd. Can you give us an update on the elk herd? What is the current status, and where are they right now?
Great. So in the 1920s, and really, up until the turn of the 20th century, the elk herd, as I said, was the largest elk herd in North America. People say it was about 15,000 to 25,000 head strong. Today, that population size of the elk herd is closer to around 7,500 to about 9,000. So it is quite a bit smaller now. The landscape now is able to support that size, that carrying capacity. Right now, the elk are, in the last month or so, have started moving and dispersing from that National Elk Refuge just north of downtown Jackson into their summer habitats. So they're starting to disperse across the valley. I actually frequently see them here at the ranch. They move up into the foothills, and they kind of follow the greening vegetation up the mountainsides, up the hillsides, as the snow melts, as the fresh forbs start to pop up out of the ground. That's their primary summer food source.
Great. We have a question from Linda. Linda asks, do you think this would have happened in the Tetons without the hidden help of the Rockefellers?
I'd like to think so. Certainly, Rockefeller, having the funding and the capacity to do this work, and then to gift that land to the National Park Service. Not everyone can do that, but I do think that there were enough voices for conservation, enough people who cared about the natural beauty of this area, that I'd like to think that some efforts would have been accomplished. I'm not sure it would have been accomplished to the scale or perhaps quickly enough to protect the essential natural beauty of this area.
We have a few questions about your involvement with the ranch. So, number one, what drew you to working at the ranch, and did you ever meet Marty?
Marty is and has been for a long time one of my conservation heroes. So while not from Wyoming originally, having studied and really been brought up in the field professionally, the conservation field professionally, she's always been a female conservation hero of mine. So I was familiar with her work, familiar with Olaf's work, and deeply admired his naturalist skills. So when the opportunity came to work for the science schools as one of the preeminent education institutions in my field, and to couple that with being able to live on the ranch and steward this magnificent place, I was just thrilled. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
Did you ever meet Marty?
Sadly, no, I did not. I was alive when she was here, but I never was out here in the early 2000s. I do have some colleagues that I work with who do remember meeting her, and so who have that personal memory and that personal story that they can add on to their retelling of the Murie story.
Okay. You might know the answer to this question. Are there any books about the Muries and their work?
Yes, there are several. I think as Matt mentioned, I did just publish a short book on the Muries, a joint biography of their life story and their love for each other. So that one is available. Marty and Olaus themselves were beautiful writers, and they've written some of their own autobiographies. So Two in the Far North, written by Marty Murie, Journeys to the Far North, written by Olaf. And the couple wrote a joint book, a collection of stories about this place, the Jackson Hole area, called Wapiti Wilderness. That's a beautiful read. And there was also a book published called Arctic Dance about the life of Marty Murie. It's a wonderful book, and it is coupled with a video on Marty and her legacy that's narrated actually by Harrison Ford.
Oh, interesting. So we have a few questions about fences. Mark asks, have many of the fences been removed to allow for pronghorn migration?
Yeah. Great question. There is a lot of current conservation work, and past conservation work going on around establishing viable wildlife corridors that enable wildlife to move and migrate through this region, which is an important corridor for species that are moving throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, following food sources from summer grounds into winter feeding grounds. So there's a lot of efforts to remove one or two rungs of those iconic buck rail fences. And what I mean by buck rail, it's kind of a triangular shaped fence made up of a tree typically called lodgepole pine that grows long and straight. And that shape, that triangle, because of its width and its height, most species, including pronghorn, including elk, can't jump over it. So if you remove some of those rungs in certain areas, then wildlife can coalesce in those areas where the fences are lowered and cross through. There's also efforts just to remove that kind of fencing altogether.
Great, and just a few more questions. So we have some questions about the ranch, and I believe you showed a few photos of the ranch there towards the end. Do Rhodes Scholar participants stay at the ranch?
They do. In several of our programs that are based specifically here at the Murie Ranch, Rhodes Scholar participants are in the original historic Dude Ranch cabins that were built back in the 1920s. They've been retrofitted a little bit, so they're more comfortable now than they would have been then. But they stay in the guest cabins. The primary programming is happening in our main building called the Homestead Building. That's where meals are. That's where classroom lectures are. It's the community gathering spot for not only participants, but for the other staff that live on site who participate in communal meals and gatherings.
Great. And how big is the ranch? How many acres?
Well, the ranch originally was a 167-acre parcel. So that's what the Muries purchased back in 1945. But one thing I didn't mention in the story is that in 1968, the Muries actually sold the ranch back to the National Park Service for a rather small fee with with resident leases of various lengths. So essentially it enabled Murie family members to continue living on the ranch for their lifetimes. But it also ensured that when they passed away, that this property would be part of a contingent and whole Grand Teton National Park. So it was no longer an in-holding.
Okay, and our final question is from Phyllis, and Phyllis would like to know, is there any wildlife in the area that you see year after year that you could recognize?
Certainly. Certainly not every species or every individual in this species, but there are some rather iconic, charismatic megafauna, large wildlife that that are in some ways staples of this area. So one of those is 399. She is a grizzly sow who is, I believe, 24 years old this year. And with the park reopening on Monday, she was actually spotted in her regular range right up in Yellowstone, at the southern end of Yellowstone National Park. And she has 4 little cubs with her, which is astounding at her age, and astounding because 4 is a rather large number for a grizzly bear to sire. So pretty incredible. But she's one of the great staples that people just love to see, and she's kind of made a livelihood for herself and her cubs along roadways, which is probably strategic because it means in some ways it's a little counterintuitive, but it's going to protect her young a little bit from predation, perhaps from other male grizzly bears that might be trying to establish territory or, dominate their own young.
Wow, that is amazing. I would love to continue this conversation, but unfortunately that concludes our webinar for today. So big thank you to Christen and Teton Science Schools. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about the Muries, we encourage you to explore our Rhodes Scholar programs in the Tetons, and also please check out Christen's book. What's the name of the book, Christen?
It's a very alluring title. It's called A Short Biography of
Okay.
Marty and Olaus Murie.
Okay, and it's available on Amazon, right?
Correct.
Okay, and thanks again, Christen.
Thank you.